Welcome to the almost the closing of our 36th season of the World War II History Roundtable programs.
As Don mentioned, this is a follow-up program to the one we had in the end of October on Operation Torch. And our author tonight is Leo Barron. He's the author of 4 books on military history and 1 novel, Up Plan Folda, World War III, a book on the Cold War. He was born in St. Paul but raised in Detroit. This is his second presentation at the World War II Roundtable. His first visit in 2014 primarily discussed one day of operations of the 101st Airborne Division at Bastogne in the Battle of the Bulge. The talk was based on his book, No Silent Night, which received an award from the Arizona Authors Association for Best Nonfiction in 2013. He has an undergraduate degree from the College of Holy Cross and a graduate degree in history from Western Michigan University. And I don't have this in my notes, but you got another graduate degree from the University of Minnesota?
I didn't actually finish.
Okay, he studied at the University of Minnesota. He served 2 tours in Iraq with the 101st Airborne Division as an infantry and an intelligence officer. He currently works as a contractor for Jacobs as an instructor at the U.S. Army Intelligence Center at Fort Huachuca, Arizona, teaching Army intelligence officers in the Military Intelligence Officer Transition Course. His articles about Bastogne and other related military topics have appeared in Infantry Magazine, Military Intelligence, Professional Bulletin, World War II Magazine, and World War II History Magazine. He feels that history is exciting. Yay. Too often people associate history as a record of events and dates. To me, history is a story. It has a plot, it has good guys, it has bad guys, it has climaxes, it has cliffhangers. It's more riveting than any fictional account. I wish Hollywood would believe that. Much of tonight's presentation will be based on his book, Patton's First Victory, How General Patton Turned the Tide in North Africa and Defeated the Afrika Korps at El Ghoutar. We had hoped to have 2 veterans of the North African campaign here. One of them, Fred Topel, was here in October, but he's coming up on his 101st birthday and he just couldn't make it tonight, and we also had hoped to get a ranger here from Grand Rapids, but it wasn't going to happen. So I'll have comments from the oral histories I did with a lot of 34th Division veterans after Leo talks, and then that'll be followed by questions and answers. So please welcome Leo Barron as he relates the story of the Allied victory in North Africa to commemorate the anniversary of events that were taking place 80 years ago right now in North Africa.
Tonight, obviously, we're going to be talking about El Ghoutar. We are going to talk a little bit about Kasserine Pass to kind of set up the context of how El Ghoutar came about. I will make some references back to the Patton movie, which I'm sure everyone's going to have questions about, and then we'll kind of wrap it up and talk about what happened after El Ghoutar and how the Allies were able to finally clear the Axis out of North Africa. As Doug mentioned, we have Operation Torch in November of '42. The Allies make 3 major landings at Algiers, Oran, and Casablanca, and a couple other smaller places. And despite all the mishaps, the Americans are able to land successfully and establish a beachhead in North Africa. At this same time, Montgomery, with his 8th Army, is chasing Rommel back across Western Egypt, through Libya, and towards Tunisia, okay? So the original plan was we're going to land at these places, and then almost immediately from Algiers, we're going to send a force to take Tunisia. This is the Allies. Because as you can see, the distance between Sicily and Tunis is pretty short. And we understood that the Germans are probably going to reinforce and create a bastion, if you will, in Tunisia. And so we wanted to beat them to it before they could do it. And so there was a race to who could get to Tunisia first. Now you would think with U.S. forces and British forces in Algiers, which is about 400, 500 miles roughly, that we had a good shot at getting to Tunisia. But as we all know, that's not what happened. The last half of November, it was kind of an ad hoc thing, British units here, American units there. It wasn't very organized. And when they got to Tunisia, the Germans were coming in, by air and by ship. And one of the first big miscalculations that the Allies had was they thought that the German units and the Italian units that are being brought into North Africa, into Tunisia, were second, third-rate units, and they weren't going to bring that many in. That was wrong. They ended up bringing in fact, some of the first units were German Fallschirmjäger units or German paratrooper units, and then ultimately they brought in the 10th Panzer Division, which is a crack panzer division. They were one of the ones at the Battle of Sedan in 1940 that raced across to the English Channel. They had been reconstituted after their serious drubbing in Russia. But yeah, the 10th Panzer Division was going to come over, and the 10th Panzer Division is going to figure prominently. In fact, it's the main bad guy in the Battle of El Ghoutar. So we get to the end of November. We get into the beginning of December. We have a series of engagements on the 1st to 3rd December, the Taborba engagement, and then the German attack, Mejred el-Bab, in first through the 6th and 10th of December. And in those battles, the Germans are able to successfully establish a bastion. And eventually Eisenhower realizes that we're not going to take Tunisia as quickly as we thought we were. The last real attempt, if you want to call it that, was in 26 December at Long Stop Hill, where the Coldstream Guards and the 18th Infantry Regiment tried to hold on to Long Stop Hill, which is a key piece of terrain that overwatched some of the roads up to Tunisia, up to Tunis, and they weren't able to hold on to it. The Germans were able to retake it, and eventually the Allies basically fell back here to a mountain range known as the Eastern Dorsals. So we have the Eastern Dorsals here and the Western Dorsals here. And Tunisia is very different from the rest of North Africa. Rommel had been used to fighting in the desert, flat, featureless, and Tunisia is nothing like that. It's mountainous, and it becomes a battle of the mountain passes, basically. And the result is that's where all the major battles happen. That's why it's Kasserine Pass, among other things. So Rommel, at the end of January, basically finally shows up after being chased across North Africa. But at the same time, he delays Montgomery. And so Montgomery isn't quite there yet with his 8th Army. So there's a period of time where the Axis actually has somewhat of a combat overmatch in terms of combat power. They got more units, and all they have to deal with is the 1st British Army and the U.S. Second Corps. And you've got basically the 5th Panzer Army under von Arnim, and then Rommel's army that came across North Africa. And that's where we get to the Battle of Kasserine Pass. And the first battle you see happens on 30 January in Fayed, which is where the 19th French Corps was stationed. And the Germans thought that was a weak spot, and it was. And they hit, and the French commander asked General Friedenthal for reinforcements, and they sent Combat Command A under the command of General McQuillan. And McQuillan, we haven't really kind of figured out how to use armor yet, and they basically do like a mad cavalry charge with tanks. And if you've done that, one of the things you learn about fighting in the desert is you actually want to move slow, because you don't want to kick up a lot of dust, because it basically silhouettes your tank. Well, we hadn't figured that out yet. So these tanks come charging out at high speeds, and the Germans are basically waiting with these anti-tank ambushes, and they actually bait the American tanks to come into this kill sack, and within a couple minutes they'd knock out 9 Shermans, and it's a complete disaster. So they make the decision that they're probably not going to be able to hold the Fayed, but Friedenthal, who's getting ready to plan an offensive south of there in McNassie, doesn't think the Germans are going to keep on attacking. He thinks the Germans are just going to keep on consolidating, which was a bad idea. So in fact, the Germans are getting ready to attack. They've got all this advantage temporarily until Montgomery shows up. And so there's two German operations, Frugelswind and Morgenluft, which is basically a panzer attack and a double envelopment down here at City Bauzid. And so that is where Lieutenant Colonel Waters was captured. And that battle started on the 14th of February. That's kind of what kicks off Kasserine Pass. And interestingly enough, Eisenhower actually visited that spot right before the battle happened. And he just kind of was looking at it and going, these guys kind of seem like they're out on a limb. But he made the decision. He's like, I'm not going to interfere in Friedenhall's tactics. He's obviously made a decision. There's got to be a reason why these guys are out here. So I'm just going to let it happen. And sure enough, the Germans recognized the exact same thing, and they basically conducted a double envelopment. The 10th Panzer Division came in from the north, the 21st came in from the south, and they surround the Iowa Regiment, the 168th Infantry, as well as elements from Combat Command A, to include Lieutenant Colonel John Waters, and he's ultimately captured. The Germans end up, the 168th Infantry Regiment, for all practical purposes, is destroyed. If the men weren't killed, most of them were captured. And that pretty much unhinges the entire Allied line in the eastern dorsals. And so General Anderson, the British commander of 1st Army, decides to fall back to the western dorsals here and wait out to see what happens and go on the defensive. Interestingly enough, so there's a period of time, so that basically ends around February 16th and February 17th. And during this time, the German commanders are bickering. And it really kind of hurt them. Even though Rommel was technically the senior guy, him and Arnhem had different ideas of what they wanted to do. And so there were several days, there was kind of like an operational paralysis with the German army. And had that not happened, it could have been really bad for the Allies. Ultimately, Field Marshal Kesselring had to come down and kind of settle the debate and said, we're going to go with Rommel's plan instead of going with von Arnhem's plan. And Rommel's plan was to get to Tabesa, which was a huge Allied supply dump, massive. And he believed that if he got to Tabesa, captured it, maybe destroyed it, that it would completely set back the Allied effort in North Africa and maybe potentially force the Allies to withdraw as far back as Morocco. And so that was his overall game plan. And Friedenhall was starting to basically break at this point in terms of his state of mind. It got to the point where he's actually calling Rommel the professor as a sign of respect, if you will. And there were stories about him standing outside his headquarters, his faces in his hands. Not good for your corps commander looking like that. So on the 19th of February, the main German attack happens. And they're basically marching up here through Kasserine Pass. Right there. All right. And in the process, they also cause basically a rout. Even before the Germans attack, it's kind of like the word's out, rumors, and Allied units, specifically American units, start to fall back en masse. And it's just a complete pell-mell retreat. It's not one of our finest hours. The Germans actually get to Kasserine Pass, and there's an engineer regiment and the 26th Infantry Regiment are defending along Kasserine Pass, but they're not dug in. They just showed up there. So there's not any foxholes. They hadn't planted any mines. And the Germans basically, drive right through the valley and almost completely upset the entire Allied line. And if it wasn't for the intervention of the artillery from the 1st Infantry Division and artillery from the 9th Infantry Division, which basically stopped the German advance, Rommel could have probably gotten all the way up to Tabesa. But thankfully, it didn't happen, okay? And so now we're kind of getting into the beginning of the movie of Patton, where they see all the wreckage. It really was a pretty significant Allied disaster. We're probably looking at, give or take, when we look at the tally, 5,000 casualties, of which probably half are prisoners of war at this point, which is also a problem because men aren't fighting hard enough. There shouldn't have been that many POWs. 183 tanks, 208 pieces of artillery lost, over 300 jeeps, and over 100 half-tracks were lost or destroyed. It sounds like a normal day in the Russian army in Ukraine. So it's just a bad story all around for the American army. And Friedenthal was someone who was picked by Marshall. Marshall thought Friedenthal was going to be a great general, and pretty soon Eisenhower is learning through General Bradley, who came down to visit, General Harmon, who actually showed up right after Kasserine Pass, that Friedenthal was done. He was a broken man, and so they made the decision to fire him. And so then the question becomes, who are we going to replace him with? So Patton at this time was already training up to land the 7th Army at Sicily, and Mark Clark was training the 5th Army for the Salerno invasion. So Eisenhower actually went to Mark Clark first. Mark Clark and Eisenhower at this time were pretty close, and Mark Clark, who he was just as much of a prima donna as Patton was, he actually turns down the offer. He's like, a Corps commander, that's kind of a step down for me. I'm already an Army commander. Why do I want to be a Corps commander? So he declines the offer. So then he goes to Patton, and Patton at this time just wants to kill Germans. And so he's like, okay, great. And he's also worried about his son-in-law, because I said his son-in-law has been captured, and he doesn't know what's happened to him at this point. But yeah, ultimately he just wants to get into the fight, and so he gladly takes over the job. So he finds out about the command change on 6th March, and then on 7th March, he shows up and takes over the command of 2nd Corps. And probably you've heard the stories. He was like, oh, these guys, they don't look like soldiers. I got to whip them into shape. I'm going to start charging them, for not being in uniform. There's like a $15 fine for not wearing a necktie, and $10 fine for not wearing the gaiters on their legs. And the guys in 2nd Corps really actually weren't too happy about Patton doing all this. Interestingly enough, there was some friction, but the one thing that did happen that hadn't happened before was, and this wasn't necessarily Patton's doing, it just was the fortunes of war. At Kasserine Pass, all the U.S. units were spread out, and they weren't working with their parent headquarters. So 18th Infantry wasn't working with 1st Infantry Division headquarters, nor was the 26th Infantry. And Combat Command A wasn't necessarily working with 1st Armored Division headquarters. And so we had a lot of units working with unfamiliar units. They hadn't built that habitual relationship. After Kasserine, all those units were brought together. So 1st Infantry Division, for the first time, was going to do a combined arms operation as a division. And that was a big deal. And like I said, that really wasn't necessarily Patton's doing. That's how it ended up happening. And so what's going to happen here? So after Kasserine Pass, Rommel thinks, well, and by the way, Kasserine Pass is pretty much the last time the Germans do an operational level offensive in North Africa. Rommel realizes that Montgomery has finally showed up, and he's got to start looking at the Meurthe line, which is a defensive line, actually built by the French to keep the Italians out in the 1930s. And now it's being used by the Germans and the Italians to keep the British out. And so, but that's where the Germans set up their defensive line. And he's like, I got to keep the 8th Army out, and I'm not going to worry so much about 1st Army, which is General Anderson, and of course, the U.S. 2nd Corps. And part of it is the fact that he took the measure of the American Army, and he's like, I'm not going to worry about these guys. They're small potatoes. And I think the Patton movie does a pretty good job of kind of showing the disdain. And there's interesting accounts from German soldiers who were like, yeah, these Americans, they don't know, they have all this great equipment, but they just don't fight very well. And they're not very well trained, and they don't fight hard. So there is definitely a sense of contempt that the Germans have for the American Army. The British, on the other hand, also are starting to show some contempt. Field Marshal Alexander, who was basically the commander of the 18th Army Group, which more or less becomes the major operational level commander under Eisenhower. It's an apocryphal story, but supposedly he said to Eisenhower after they got rid of Friedenthal, he said, "You got to have better men than this." And so Eisenhower was like, "All right, well, you know." And so they, like I said, they bring in Patton. But so there isn't just a contempt from the German side, but there's a sense on the British side of like, who have we gotten ourselves shackled with? The British actually said, you know, the Americans are our version of the Italians. What the Italians are to the Germans, the Americans are to us. So there had to be something to kind of right the ship. And the first go at it is Operation, and I'm going to spell out the word because it's not politically correct anymore, Operation WOP. That was the actual name of the operation. And not surprisingly, it was going to be against the Italians. It's true. So that was going to be the operation. And the point was they wanted to seize Gafsa and then on to get to El Guitar. And the reason why they wanted to do that was at this time, Montgomery was starting to apply pressure down here, if you want to call it that, on the Meerut line. It was going to be Operation Pugilist. And so the plan was to try to draw German forces from the Meerut line up to here, kind of as a, you know, a diversion, as a feint. And that was the overall plan. And they felt it was an easy thing for the Americans to do. You're not trying to win any major battles. You're just trying to get the Germans to come your way so that the British can do all the hard work and you know, defeat the German army. And in fact, we'll even make it easy for you because the first guy you're going to be fighting isn't even the Germans. Okay, it's the Centauro division. It's an Italian division. And by this point, you know, the Italians are starting to obviously lose morale and, you know, they're on the way out. And so the British are like, General Anderson is like, you should be able to handle this. So Patton, of course, attacks this with vigor, and he assigns the Big Red One, the 1st Infantry Division, for this mission. Patton felt after he visited the Big Red One that they were the most seasoned unit that he had, and so he was going to give them the toughest job. Now, if you look at this, the Italians owned the high ground. If you guys see enough war movies, you know, Little Round Top and what have you, you know, Bunker Hill, having the high ground is a pretty important thing, and certainly the case here in North Africa. And the Italians, when they set up their defense, they were like, hey, if we can defend this valley and hold on to this high ground, no one's going to want to go through here. You know, it's almost impossible. So I would argue this book that I just wrote, even though Patton's in the title, is probably a lot more about General Allen than it is about General Patton. So General Allen is a big believer in night fighting, which at the time was, you know, we do that all the time now, but at the time that was, you know, almost heretical. No one fought at night. But Allen had actually done nighttime operations in the First World War when he was a battalion commander. And he took one look at this and he was like, if we try to attack this during the day, especially trying to move forces out in the open here, we're going to get slaughtered. And so he's like, we're not going to do that. We're going to do a night attack. And then he looked at Colonel Darby, who was the commander of the 1st Ranger Battalion, and he goes, what do you think you can do here? How do you think we can, you know, crack this nut? And Colonel Darby was like, how about I march my guys to the Djebel or Bada and come around and hit the Italians from behind? Because the Italians didn't think you could put a force up through those mountains. And so they didn't have any defenses up there. And General Allen was like, I think it's a great idea. And so that was what happened. So the night of March 20th, the 1st Ranger Battalion marches up through those mountains, single file, marches all through the night. And on the morning of the 21st, they're in position, and they are literally behind the Italian lines. And the Italians are all facing, all their guns are basically facing out here. And to add something else to the deception, the 26th Infantry was going to do a feint to basically fix the Italians. And so right before the Rangers attacked, the 26th Infantry Regiment attacked first. So the Italians have all their attention directed on that regiment. And then after they get focused on that, the 1st Ranger Battalion comes in behind them and basically rolls them up like a wet blanket. And for all intents and purposes, the 5th Infantry Regiment, the Italian regiment, is completely destroyed. Most of them are captured. and it's a resounding success. And as a result, this whole entire defensive line is cut wide open. So word gets back to Kesselring, and he basically makes the decision, we can't, this is bad. Because he doesn't know how far the Americans are going to go. Because at this point, we could have gone all the way, to the ocean if we had, planned it. We hadn't. And so he orders von Arnim to commit the 10th Panzer Division, okay, the one I talked about earlier, to conduct a counterattack. But that's not going to happen until March 23rd. So for the rest of March 22nd, the Allies do keep on advancing. And at a certain point, they send 2 battalions down here to occupy the Djebel Burda, which is another mountain mass that overwatches the southern half of El Guitar Valley. And then on the northern half, the other battalion of the 18th Infantry Regiment occupies this piece of high ground, Hill 482. So you've got U.S. infantry here, you got U.S. infantry here, and then eventually they bring in, at the end of the 22nd at night, they bring in the 601st Tank Destroyer Battalion to occupy El Qada Bridge, because the actual plan was, hey, we're going to keep on attacking. And so what you end up having is the Americans are thinking they're going to go on the attack, and the Germans are ready to do a counterattack, and the Germans just end up beating the Americans to the punch on the morning of the 23rd. But the problem is these units were not ready for a defense. So they had actually pushed up all the artillery. You don't want the artillery that close to the front lines. But if you're trying to do offensive operations, you want to extend your area of influence, that's what you would do with the artillery. You didn't have them this close in a defense. But because they thought we were going to go on the offense, that's why they were all really jammed up right behind the tank destroyers. And that comes back to bite us, to have the artillery that close. And these two battalions were also getting ready to conduct an attack. So that was what was going to happen, but that's not what happened. So we now get to the morning of the 23rd. The guys are getting ready to go, the Americans, and all of a sudden, the recon screen under the command of Captain Pollock, his soldiers open fire on a couple of German motorcyclists, which is basically the advanced recon of the 10th Panzer Division. They kill one of the motorcyclists, the other's injured, and immediately he tells them, I'm in the 10th Panzer Division, we're about to go on the attack. So almost immediately, we know there's something about to happen. And as the sun slowly comes up, in this entire valley is the whole entire 7th Panzer Regiment. And the American soldiers talk about the absolute precision that the German formations were using. They were just moving with this beautiful parade ground precision. It was almost, if it wasn't so scary, it was actually a pretty cool sight. And there was this realization of like, oh man, these guys are coming this way. And they were trying to basically march right up this road here, very similar to what happened at Kasserine Pass. But that's not what happened, okay? So they start coming up here, and then they send 1 battalion of infantry to the north, another battalion of infantry here, and then a motorcycle Krautschützen battalion up here on the southern hill mass. And almost immediately, they come under heavy artillery fire from the Americans. And then the American tank destroyers start attacking the tanks. Now, I know it sounds really exciting. You're like, tank destroyers. That just sounds so cool. That just, you think Star Wars, tank destroyers. Well, that's what you're looking at. And if it looks like it was kind of thrown together at the last minute, you would be correct. So that gun right there, and the guys who were in the student outreach program, they already know the answer, is the M1897, model 1897 75 millimeter gun. So can anyone guess why it was called 1897? That's when it was designed, 1897. So that gun is going up against the Mark IV-G and the F2, which is a state-of-the-art, at the time, which was a state-of-the-art tank. So now we got a problem, okay? We got these antiquated guns, and the reason why we had this, it wasn't because we were like, let's just kill a bunch of our soldiers and give them a piece of junk equipment. We were still tooling up for war, and so we were like, how do we get some tank destroyers out there? And we're like, we got all these half-tracks. We got all these guns left over from the First World War. How about we just throw these guns on the half-track, and now we got a tank destroyer. So that was the plan. So these guys are occupying this part of the El Khadab Ridge. There's basically 2 companies and a platoon from Alpha Company, and they start opening fire on the German tanks. And they actually enjoy some success because, like I said, they're up high, and when the German tanks start passing them, they can start getting flank shots. And even these great tanks, when they're getting hit in the flank, that's, there's not enough armor on the flank to stop these rounds. But they figure out, the tank destroyer guys figure out it takes about 4 or 5 rounds to kill one tank. So what do you think is going to start happening? They start running out of rounds. And they do. And as a result, they're like, how do we get, they're trying to get resupplied under fire. Bravo Company here, 2nd Platoon, which would be the guy in the middle, Lieutenant Ruthie, feels like he thinks he's getting bypassed by the Panzers, and so he falls back unauthorized. And that completely unhinges the tank destroyer line, and everyone starts falling back because this one platoon leader was like, I'm getting, we don't know if he actually was getting flanked, but it doesn't matter. His perception was he's getting flanked, so he falls back. Everyone starts to fall back. And now what ends up happening is, and this is what I was talking about, now the Germans have a straight go at all those artillery batteries up there on the ridge, and they do. And a lot of those batteries are ultimately overrun. So you're probably going, hey, Leo, how does the Americans win this? Well, these guys try to flank through the mountains just like the Rangers did, and they run into 3rd Battalion, 18th Infantry, and they don't get very far. They get stopped cold. Matter of fact, it's mainly K Company that stops them, under the command of a guy by the name of Captain Raymer, and they single-handedly stop this entire battalion. And so this flank attack is not going to work. Same thing happens to this southern attack. It doesn't work. They get pretty much stopped cold. As for the infantry here, in the 2nd Battalion, 86th Panzer Grenadier Regiment, well, they're puttering around in half-tracks. If you know anything about German 251s, they got open top. And so they start bringing in corps-level artillery. The American Army does. Clifton Andrus, who's the commander of artillery in the 1st Infantry Division, starts massing all this artillery. And we just start to pound the German forces relentlessly. And this is something you start to see throughout the Second World War, is the absolute dominance of American artillery. We were the ones that created the Fire Direction Center, which allowed us to basically take guns from a bunch of disparate units and bring them together with relatively little planning and mass all our fires with time on target missions at a given point. You start to see this here in North Africa. The other problem is there's this minefield here. So this choke point is very narrow. And so the German tanks start getting stuck in the minefield, and what few can get past the minefield ultimately get knocked out by the few tank destroyers that are remaining. And so by, as we get close to 9 o'clock in the morning, so this attack started like around 6, it's pretty obvious, that the Germans are probably not going to make it. But back at headquarters, we still have the Kasserine disease. And so people start thinking maybe, division headquarters, which are more or less back here, just west of El Guitar. So you're not talking very far. You could actually see the German panzers coming in. So guys start talking about retreating. And General Allen says, I will like hell pull out, and I'll shoot the first bastard that does. Now, you might think it's a general. It's hyperbole. When he was a battalion commander, we don't really know if this was true. It might just be apocryphal. When he was a battalion commander in the First World War and he wanted to do a night attack, one of his company commanders refused to do it. Supposedly, he shot him in the buttocks and said, good, you're out. Bring someone else in. And I'm sure that legend still lived on. So when he said this, I bet you a lot of guys were like, yeah, he will shoot you. So there wasn't a retreat. And wonderfully, the lines stabilize, okay? And so there's a pause in the battle. Both sides are licking their wounds, and we start bringing up more supplies. We start bringing up the 899th Tank Destroyer Battalion showed up. Their baptism of fire was quite ignoble. It was a complete disaster. They actually drove, some of the guys actually drove into their own minefield, which sadly happens a lot in the Second World War. And then the ones that don't drive into the minefield, they're not using proper tactics, and the German Panzers that are still there basically knock out. And these were the new tank destroyers. These are the M10s tank destroyers with the 3-pound gun. So yeah, but anyways, it's stalemate at this point. And Allied intelligence, because we have tactical signals intelligence, we can intercept the German communications. We realize through these intercepts, and this is not ultra, this is just guys finding the radio frequencies that the Germans are talking on, that the Germans are getting ready to go again, at exactly 1600, in fact. So everyone starts getting prepared, reconstituting their forces, bringing up more ammunition, bringing up more artillery. 1600 rolls around, nothing happens, okay? General Allen by this point is getting pretty anxious. So at 4:15, so 15 minutes later, and by the way, if you intel guys here, you don't want to do this because it makes the intel guys go crazy. Allen actually gets on the German radio net and says, "What the hell are you guys waiting for? We've been ready since 4 p.m." And the reason why that's a bad thing is because you're basically telling the enemy, "Hey, we're listening in on your radio." Okay. Yeah, I can imagine Monk Dixon probably had a heart attack. He's like, "What are you doing? You don't do that. Don't let them know." But anyway, so the Germans do eventually attack. And once again, it's an artillery fest. It's an artillery slaughter. This time it's mainly infantry from these two battalions. The Panzers, what are left of them, kind of, stay in the background. They basically use their standoff advantage. It doesn't work. So it's just the infantry that are coming up the valley, and they get slaughtered by the American artillery. It's an absolute bloodbath. And in fact, the movie actually shows Patton saying, "What a hell of a waste of good infantry." He actually said that, but he wasn't talking about American infantry. He was talking about German infantry, because it was a completely one-sided fight. They were getting slaughtered. Colonel Darby thought it reminded him of the Civil War and the Confederates coming up, at Pickett's charge and just getting slaughtered by General Hunt's artillery. And it was that kind of one-sided battle. These guys, 2nd Battalion, once again, they try to sweep around the flank of the 1st Infantry Division, and they run into K Company. And interestingly enough, it becomes a battle of hand grenades. K Company has the high ground. The Germans are trying to get up on the high ground. And if you have the high ground and it's a battle of hand grenades, guess what? You're going to win, because even if your hand grenade misses, it's going to keep on rolling down and probably hit the next guy. If you're on the low ground and you throw that hand grenade, well, if you don't throw it far enough, guess what? Now that hand grenade's coming back down on you. And so there's interesting corroborating evidence on both sides of the hand grenades just going back and forth. But once again, it's the American artillery that wins the day. There's actually a tragic incident where there's a fratricide incident where the American artillery comes in too close, and it actually lands on top of K Company and kills a bunch of K Company soldiers. One of the survivors was a mortarman by the name of Walter Ehlers, who, if you know anything about D-Day, he ended up winning the Medal of Honor a couple days after D-Day. So he was a big 1st Infantry Division guy, but he was actually only a corporal at this point, and he remembers the artillery coming in, and he was friendly artillery, and it basically knocked him senseless. And he still has ringing. He basically mentioned how he still had ringing in his ears for the rest of his life from that American artillery. But by 7, 8 o'clock at night, it's pretty obvious that the German attack has ended, and it's a complete and stunning tactical American victory. So interestingly enough, in the movie, they had Patton there in the morning. Patton wasn't there in the morning. He was there in the afternoon, the second attack. Patton was there for that. He wasn't there in the first attack, even though the movie shows him kind of in the morning waiting for that attack to come. But he was there for the second attack. So ultimately, what ends up happening after El Guitar is the Germans start to get pushed, further and further into this pocket here. And eventually, interestingly enough, Patton is only in charge of the Second Corps till the end of March. So he's really only in charge of that corps for better part of, 3 or 4 weeks. And he is replaced by General Omar Bradley. And Patton goes back to getting ready the 7th Army for the invasion of Sicily. By May 8th, May 9th, the Germans are defeated, and they're basically squeezed into these two pockets up in here in Bizerta and Tunis, and then up here by Cape Bomb. And Stalingrad, by the way, it only happened, a couple weeks prior to this, a couple months prior to this. But in Tunisia, you're talking 245,000 Axis prisoners at the end of the Tunisia campaign. So in terms of numbers, it was actually worse than Stalingrad. The 10th Panzer Division, completely destroyed. Never got reconstituted. That was the end of the war for the 10th Panzer Division. Some of these divisions came back to life, like the 15th Panzer Division fought on as the 15th Panzer Grenadier Division. Rommel's favorite, the 21st Panzer, of course, they were at D-Day. But yeah, 10th Panzer Division, they were like the 9th Legion. Never got reconstituted, disappeared, and that was the end of the war for them. And when they finally clear the Axis from Tunisia, Alexander was happy to report, that he sent a communique to, to Churchill that, North Africa is now clear of Axis forces. And then there's that famous statement on the part of Churchill where he goes, it's not the beginning of the end. It's not even, the end of the beginning. And so in clear Churchillian style. But yeah, this was pretty much it. After this, the German army really wasn't the same again. The German army really at North Africa was probably when we were fighting the German army at their best. And you start to see after North Africa a significant degradation of their capabilities, the training of the soldiers. And so what ends up happening is, and I'm not trying to sell anyone short, but the guys that we fought in 44 and 45 were not the same caliber of soldiers that these guys fought in 42 and 43. In fact, in 42 and 43, the Luftwaffe was still a problem. By D-Day, the Luftwaffe was pretty much non-existent. All throughout, even in El Guitar, there were German airstrikes, Stuka strikes, Ju-88 strikes on the American lines. That wasn't a problem by D-Day. So you really think about what the American forces had to do and learn on the fly. And then the difference between Kasserine, which was February, mid-February, and El Guitar, which is only a month later. And the fact that the Americans, not just Patton, but the American army was starting to turn things around. And interestingly enough, there are even some British historians who talk about, it took the British a couple of years to kind of crack the code on how to beat the Wehrmacht, and it really only took us a couple months, which is a tribute to the American army. So that pretty much concludes my brief.
It's getting obviously harder and harder to have veterans here, but I spent a lot of time interviewing veterans over the years, and so their words and their memories go on. And one of the things I discovered when I was doing oral histories with them, I'm a veteran, and I talked to them on their own level. The norm was the families would say, well, Dad never talks about the war, he won't tell you anything. And then they talk to me for 3 to 10 hours. And they tell the stories that they told their buddies, but won't tell other people. So some of these stories that I'm going to read maybe are unpleasant. Band of Brothers dealt with some of them, but they're the stories that usually don't make it into the movies. So I've got a number of veterans. It's going to take a little while, and then we'll have questions after. This is Glenn Belseth from Milan, Minnesota. He was an M Company 135th Infantry Regiment. Glenn attempted to land with his unit in the capture of Algiers Harbor as part of the terminal force on the British destroyer Malcolm, but it was turned away by heavy French artillery fire in the early morning of the initial invasion on 8 November. Eventually the Malcolm sank, but the crew and infantrymen on board were rescued. Glenn and the other men were eventually landed on the beach, and he experienced the frustration of trying to dig a foxhole in loose North African beach sand. The more I dug, the more the sand came in. Then we got to stay in a school building guarding the German consulate. Glenn was one of the very first Americans to deal with Germans instead of French. They were scared stiff, but one guy in our group could speak German. There was one of the blondes who didn't think we understood. She started walking down the street, and of course, we knew she was just testing us. They yelled, "Halt!" and she came right back. When we first landed on the beach, we had our first experience with the Arabs. They were a different culture. Our barracks bags came in, and they tried to steal them. It got so bad that they wouldn't yield. We didn't fire at them, but we fired by them. That was the only way to make them understand. We stayed in Algiers through Christmas. While there, we had bomb attacks every night. We got so shell-shocked, they had to put a guard on the wooden bathroom door just to tell them not to slam the door because everyone was so jittery. We left Algiers battle-prepared on French 40 and 8 boxcars. And the way I remember our first engagement was a night attack at Pichon. In a later engagement around Kasserine, we were pinned down. We dug foxholes. Then they called in tank support. I recall just watching these tanks getting picked off one after the other with German 88s. That smell of burned flesh you'll never forget. Glenn was sent home from Italy in late 1943 because he had foot issues. He was one of the very first to come home to his hometown. He found his leave at home difficult because of questions people asked. Did you kill anyone? That kind of irked me. So I started to walk in the back alleys to get away from people. Glenn was sent to a training unit at Camp Crowder, Missouri. Until the end of the war, he was discharged in 1945. Victor Knopp from northeast Minneapolis, Battery B, 175th Field Artillery. Victor made the initial landing in Algiers on 8 November 1942. His battery joined the race to capture Tunisia, leaving Algiers on 15 November. We started for Tunisia, and we got there on the 18th of November. We passed the British troops who were marching on the road. We came into Majez al-Bab. We were parked with the French. We got a quick march order and went over the hill above the town, and that's where we started digging. That dirt was really hard. These German planes came back and started strafing and bombing. They were real low. I seen the machine gun bullets come right around us. We were firing our rifles at them. I tell you, we had our holes dug about 4 feet by nightfall. Using British 25-pound cannons, Battery B is credited with firing the first artillery round by an American unit in the European theater. Vic had a camera and documented the event. Here are the 4 guns of the battery in their positions at Majez el-Bab on 19 November 1942. Now, keep in mind, the stories I'm reading, these are all Minnesota guys. You know, this is the 34th Division. This is our hometown guys. Yeah, so here, did you go through all 4? Okay, there's 4. So here's the 4 guns in the battery position at Majez el-Bab on 19 November. The engraved casing, to the last one. Okay, the engraved casing from the first round can be seen at the Minnesota Military Museum at Camp Ripley. Victor remained with the 175th through the end of the Italian campaign. His war ended on the Swiss border. He flew home on a troop-carrying B-17 and was discharged at Fort Snelling. But there's more to the story. This is Gordon Bennett from Minneapolis, Battery B of the 175th Field Artillery. Gordon also made the initial landing in Algiers on 8 November with the 175th. From the stories Gordon told me, I think he spent most of the war looking for stiff drinks. This is his story about the first round. Well, I was under the battery commander's detail, and we rode up on a Jeep with another couple of battery commander detail people. Captain Kinley gave me the command. I gave the command down on the radio. We took number 1 gun, fired that shell. One of those guys out of South Minneapolis or Richfield pulls the lanyard. I think it was Joey Pichet. But that was the first shell fired by Americans in World War II. That was the start of it, November 19th. Leon Spill was Colonel Kelly's driver. It was driving him crazy because the shells were rolling around back and forth in the back seats. So he threw it out. Now, all of a sudden, here comes a whole bunch of big brass coming up there, and they want to know where the shell is. Kelly says, I don't know, we threw it out. There's a whole pile of them over there. Go get one. They saved a brass casing. I think they had pictures or photographers there that took pictures of that shell casing. And then I don't know if it was Kelly or Captain Kinley, sent it back to Minneapolis, and they engraved all the names on the battery alphabetically and polished it up. Is it the first casing? One of the first. Okay. Jaundice and malaria kept Gordon out of the early phases of the Italian campaign. He rejoined the unit at Cassino and was medically evacuated out of Anzio to Naples, where he was very involved in the Nepalese black market activities. Eventually, he was sent to Camp Crowder, Missouri, where they made him an MP. Before being discharged in December 1944. After the war, he worked as a bartender. Thomas Countryman, Sioux Falls, South Dakota, B Company, 109th Quartermaster. Thomas Countryman came from a distinguished background. His father was a naval flight instructor in World War I. His maternal grandfather received the Medal of Honor in the Spanish-American War. His paternal grandfather was legal counsel and vice president of James J. Hill's Great Northern Railroad. The Depression hit the family hard. In college, he was in the CMTC program, and the 25 cents per hour was a good reason to join the National Guard. He has many stories about the horrible food provided by the British. We landed on Thanksgiving in Oran. We organized until the whole company came in, and then we went to Tunisia. But we didn't get any time off. We were with an infantry unit. We camped out in pup tents in the middle of nowhere. At Maktar, we camped in the following morning. We camped in the following morning. We're totally covered in snow. Now, keep in mind, they didn't have down sleeping bags. Your average infantryman had one blanket. That was it. I managed to get a couple of extra blankets, and so I made my own bedroll using mattress covers as sheets. He was in a truck unit. He could carry it. The infantry couldn't. We had motorized patrols where we would take out trucks and pick up a company of infantry, and that would be the patrol. We had a case where we had a patrol, another group had a patrol, and we were to meet at a certain point. We got there probably 3 or 4 in the morning. Everybody was sound asleep in the trucks, but I was on guard duty. But a patrol walked right by us, and as I was looking at them, at the time I was a gunner. I was on the turret on the top of the truck. I looked at the guys and I thought, that can't be. But I let them go by. They were Germans. Probably a platoon. They got down ahead of us a little ways down the road, and they encountered the other company of infantry that was coming the other direction. That's when they had a firefight. This really woke me up for the first time. We're at war. About the time of the Battle of Kasserine, it seemed like every morning at 7 o'clock the Germans would come over and dive bomb and strafe. So one morning they came over, and they were lower than ever, and all kinds of them. It turns out it was an air battle between British Spitfires and German Messerschmitt 109s. They were right down on the ground. Everybody was shooting at each other, and we were shooting at them. It turns out we ended up shooting down one of the British Spitfires flown by an American pilot. He was mad. He was mad that he'd been shot down by his own people. So he came out to the unit that afternoon, and he got hold of the officers. From then on, we were ordered not to fire at any planes unless we were actually being fired upon. We had a supply depot, and that night, this was after the officers told us we couldn't shoot at enemy planes unless they were actually shooting at us. So this one lone German plane came around trying to get somebody to shoot at them so we could know so they would know where we were. He even flashed his lights. There was an Arab house off in the fields that was probably 500-600 yards away from us. And this night when the plane was flying around, all of a sudden the door opens up on this Arab cabin, and it's opening and closing, and people are coming and going out. I was a high-score shooter and was issued an .03 Springfield with a scope. You can see it, it's carrying it in that picture. The sergeant was concerned that he was flashing the Germans. He said, "Countrymen, take them out." So I fired one shot, and I know I blew him right through that doorway because the next morning I saw the funeral. But I still remembered and regretted that incident. From his standpoint, All he was probably doing was looking at the airplane, something he'd never seen before. I remember driving one time on the road, and all of a sudden came upon a tent set up on the side with a sign on the front saying, "Quartermaster Shower Unit." I don't know whose it was, but we wheeled right in there. It didn't make any difference who you were or what your rank was. You walked in that gate, threw your clothes away, and they gave you brand new clothes. Oh boy, just the shower, a hot shower. It had been several months. Being a truck driver, we were able to carry a lot more stuff with us. I remember one time driving along, here's an Arab standing out there holding a basket. He had 3 dozen eggs in it. I screeched to a halt and traded him my mattress cover from my bedroll. He gave me that. I gave him that. He paid me 3 dozen eggs. I ate them all in one day, 3 dozen eggs. During Kasserine, we were at a place called Kef El Amir Pass. We had a gas dump there. When all this came in, we got orders to get our gas out of there. I remember loading trucks with gasoline on a frantic midnight move. We had one big old guy by the name of Bernie Grove. He could pick up 4 loaded jerry cans, 2 in each hand, and just throw them in the back of the truck. Each can is 54 pounds. Here I am weighing only 123 pounds. Shortly thereafter, there was a retreat on our part. There was an infantry unit trapped over somewhere in the valley. There were no roads. Probably only the American Army can do this. So the engineers took a bulldozer and built us a road so we could take some trucks in there and pull these guys out. We went in there, loaded the trucks up with troops, shipped them out, and the lieutenant and I stayed there with the Jeep just in case there were any stragglers that showed up. We stayed almost all night, and just before dawn was breaking, we figured out we had to get the hell out of there because the Germans were on the other side of the valley. After the Axis surrendered, I remember hauling lots of prisoners, Germans, Italians. I remember the day we found out they surrendered. Somebody managed to bring an awful lot of wine in. We got a little rowdy. Tom stayed with the unit until the end of the war. He had lots of points and flew home on a B-17. Most of the guys had their souvenirs in barracks bags on the back of the plane. Before the flight from Brazil to Miami, Air Force guys got on the plane and went through everybody's bags. I'm the only one who kept his souvenirs because I had them in my ditty bag. Heading to Fort Snelling through Chicago, I remember my buddy, who was actually a little bit older than I was, they wouldn't let him into a nightclub because he couldn't prove his ID. They didn't think he was old enough. He was so goddamn mad, and I don't blame him. After the war, Tom attended college, graduated from ROTC, was activated for the Korean War, where he became a photo officer for the 43rd Infantry Division, which led to a career in photography and film production. He eventually served 17 years in various branches of the military. All his life, he had a magnificent German Shepherd, and he always named him Rommel because Tom helped beat Rommel. Alfred Westphal, Howard Lake, Minnesota, Headquarters Battery, 125th Field Artillery. One of the first draftees in the spring of 1941, he was assigned to the 34th Division in training at Camp Claiborne, Louisiana. He arrived in North Africa with the main body of the division in early January 1943. We landed at Oran, and we marched a good long way inland through the cactus and sand before we were told we could lay down and rest for the night. No pup tents, we just laid down in our shelter halves in a blanket. I was in the signal section laying wire, new to me in a wartime situation. We ran wires to the infantry, and we ran them to forward observers. The infantry was easier to find than the forward observers because he was all by himself, and you had no idea where he was. You'd get a vague description that covered miles, and you just had to kind of feel your way up. It seemed like we were always laying wire at night, which didn't help, but we always found them. I don't think I ever had a rifle shot at me that I'm aware of, but artillery, mortars, and mines. Then they come up with something new. To me it was new, the air bursts of artillery fire. It wasn't bad enough that they'd shoot one at you that would explode when it hit the ground, but they had air bursts that scattered all around, and it caught a lot of people. You weren't even safe in your foxhole. I remember one night in particular, wet, dark, cold, and one of those air bursts hit close to me, and just a few seconds afterward I heard a couple of guys hollering, "Medic! Medic!" So you knew somebody got hit. They were wicked. Once, two of us were kind of reconnoitering how far we could get with a big spool of wire. By gosh, I don't know if it was could have been a bomb, but it had to be a shell. Just lifted the front end of that truck right up in the air. I still have lead under my skin. You can see it. I decided not to take the Purple Heart. I didn't feel it was right for such a little thing, for a Purple Heart. When I saw the other guys that have lost arms and legs and all they got was the Purple Heart, I didn't want to wear it. I didn't feel eligible for it. I didn't think it was right. Shortly after Casino, he was diagnosed with yellow jaundice. After I'd been in the hospital for a month or so, I thought maybe I'd be going home because the doctor was never satisfied with my results. I would have liked to have gotten back to my outfit, but instead they put me on a hospital ship. Just delightful, with soft beds, getting up on the deck, watching the dolphins play. It was such a wonderful trip back home. We landed someplace in South Carolina. I was able to walk off the ship and I kissed the soil when I got there. I was shipped to Schick General Hospital in Clinton, Iowa. Discharged in the fall of 1944, he got a job at the Fort Snelling Fire Department and married his junior high sweetheart. She had a lot of great stories. She was a one-room school teacher during the war. Bill Quam, Duluth, A Battery, 125th Field Artillery. On the voyage to North Africa, the ship was great, but the British food was horrible. The worst experience. Merry Christmas on the ship and seaweed for dessert. I don't know what it was, but I swear it was seaweed. We landed in Iran on the 2nd of January. We had an assembly. We were supposed to pick up our equipment. I got my truck and 25-pounder back. It wasn't long that we left Iran for Tunisia. We got strafed by German aircraft. I think they were almost out of ammo. They fired a few machine gun bursts up and down the convoy. We were green as grass. We all dismounted now, and the trucks were off the road. A fellow from two Harvards, Roger Pigallo, was sitting on rocks, and he'd gotten binoculars, and he's watching these planes. Holy God, he says, I think that guy, I can see that guy, and he looks like he's coming right for me. Well, we got to a little town of Pishon, and we're going to set up our guns. And the first thing we do, of course, is send in the survey crew out to survey the area. Nobody around, not a soul. They went up this little hill, and all of a sudden an infantry guy jumps up and he says, "Get the hell out of here. You're going to draw fire." And so they did. We were still green as grass. At Hill 609, we were involved with lots of fire missions. We did a lot of shooting there. Got to the top of the hill, and the Krauts left a lot of stuff, like their artillery pieces and guns, handguns, P-38s, lots of stuff. It was all booby-trapped. There was wire around there like spider webs. You didn't dare touch any of it. I never went near it. Wounded in July in Italy's medevac back to Naples, fearing the Repo Depot replacement reassignment, he went AWOL and hitchhiked back to his unit south of Florence. He went home in December and was assigned to a mule unit at Fort Riley, Kansas. I'd never even been on a farm. The only animal I ever had was a dog. I talked to some officer, and the next day they said, "We've reassigned you to tanks." I was sure glad to get away from those animals. I was out in June of 45 and was discharged at Fort Snelling. He used the GI Bill to study engineering, got married, became very involved with the 125th Field Artillery Association. Don Frederick, Minneapolis, 1st Ranger Battalion. Don volunteered for the Rangers from the 34th Infantry Division. He participated in the initial landings at Arjou on 8 November. On the 12th of February, he participated in the Ranger raid on Sened Station. They flew us up to this airfield in Tunisia. We no sooner got out than those C-47s took off. The airport got bombed shortly after we left. So we got on trucks over to Gafsa. Then they trucked us about 20 miles towards Sened Station. 3 companies, 180 men. The Ranger companies were small. They only had 60 men. We walked all night and got within a mile. The Rangers laid low and observed the station through the day. The following night, it was the brightest moon I'd ever seen. You don't want to go on a raid when the moon's bright as day. After the moon went down about 1 o'clock, we pulled out towards Sened Station. We didn't know how many troops or what equipment they had there. We wanted to get 10 prisoners. We got up to 50 or 100 yards, and they started shooting. But one thing that saved a lot of us is that they were shooting over our heads. So when the firing started, the 3 companies went in and we practically wiped out the garrison. In fact, we got too many prisoners. We had about 18. We brought back 10. We had to get out of there before daylight. The Rangers lost 1 killed and about 18 wounded. They had to leave the killed there, and they carried out the wounded in their shelter halves. We got chased out of Gafsa. We had a big supply dump there, gasoline and ammunition. I saw that go up in smoke. I wound up at Tebessa, 2nd Corps headquarters. I was sitting on the side of this hill outside of Tebessa, and all of a sudden I heard these sirens blaring. What's going on here? There's a couple of motorcycles, and then there was a half-track. He was in it, and they had sirens on that cookie coming down this old dirt road. Boy, they were going fast. There was old Patton standing up there. Boy, he was dressed like he was going to a ball. That's the first time I ever saw that guy. Don would meet Patton 2 other guys, once in Sicily, and the third time Don was captured on the 4th of November in Italy, when Patton liberated the Moosburg German POW camp where Don was a prisoner. After the war, Don got married, stayed in the National Guard. In the Korean War, he was activated for the 47th Division and sent to Camp Ruckert, Alabama. He got into the hardware business and stayed very active with the Ranger Association. Don Mendenhall, Minneapolis, 135th Infantry and later 133rd Infantry. After graduating from high school, seeing war on the horizon, Don enlisted in the Minnesota National Guard at the Minneapolis Downtown Armory. If sent to war, he wanted to be around familiar people. When the 35th Infantry was reorganized around the time of Pearl Harbor, he and many other Minnesota men were transferred to the Iowa 133rd Infantry, also in the 34th Division. He arrived in North Africa in early January 1943. The next place we went to was Kef Elamar Pass. We went to Sabila, and we kind of dug into defensive positions along the ridge and hills, and there we encountered German artillery and tanks. We were shelled for about 2 days. Fortunately, I had taken over a hole that belonged to somebody else. It was pretty deep, but you stick your head up and you saw those big tanks coming up there off to your flank and lobbing shells up, and people were still kind of wondering what that is. Boy, when they started hitting about 10 yards away from you, you sure knew what was going on. But we were pinned down there all day, and all I remember about is they had poppies everywhere. It's like you hear about the poppies in France in World War I. The other thing that impressed me, there is some fellow that was wounded in the middle of the night. The medics couldn't get to him apparently, and he was calling out for his dad. I thought, oh, gee gads. The next morning, after the first shelling, this lieutenant said, let's get up there and see if we can gain some ground. So it was just our platoon, and we went up along the flank, and we got into a ditch by the road, and then we run across the road one at a time. That's the first time I ever experienced machine gun fire. Why we didn't get hit, I don't know, but it was like bees going by me. When we first went into combat, we took our chevrons off, and the officers took the stuff off their helmets. The Germans were trying to look for somebody to take the leaders out. The word came down from 2nd Corps, Patton, to put all the insignia back on your uniform and on your helmet, both front and back. All the officers had to wear ties. That lasted for maybe a week and a half or 2 weeks, but we knew that General Patton had something to do with that. I think I noticed a little more aggressiveness all up and down the line after that. That's one thing I always admired about him. I'd follow him anywhere, regardless of what kind of personality he had. Don came down with dysentery and hepatitis not long after landing in Italy. He went to North hospitals in North Africa and in replacement units for a few months. He came back to the States around Christmas '43. In the States, he was assigned to guard as a guard at the German POW camps, discharged at Camp Dix in 1945. On the GI Bill, he studied business and marketing and had a career with Gamble Skogmo. John Burnett, St. Paul, Minnesota, B Battery, 151st Field Artillery. I only met this guy at the end of his life, but he was a real soldier. I mean, he was 80 years old and he was ramrod straight. He had real military bearing. His nickname, even as a very young soldier in World War II, was the Little General. Quitting school after 9th grade, He lived and worked at Fort Snelling, earning $2 a day cleaning the officers' rooms, shining their shoes, etc. He got to eat leftovers in the officers' mess, thus being the best-fed person in his family. Later, he cleaned and ran the gym and bowling alley at Fort Snelling. He and his brother had a popcorn machine for the soldiers, a penny a box. One summer, they sold 28,000 boxes of popcorn, earning him $28. At 15, he joined the National Guard. He arrived in Oran as part of the Division Advance Party around Christmas 1942. At Fondue, there was a British-American situation, and our observer said that we'd have to wait for a while. The British just stopped to have tea. That's no kidding. They moved right along, and at tea time, they'd have their tea. Don't interfere with that darn tea, you know. But we were on a firing mission in support of the infantry, and all of a sudden we got the ceasefire, and the guns were loaded. So we didn't know whether or not it was safe, because they hadn't fired. But we cleared everybody away from the guns. The exec and I unloaded the guns. We kept one man to catch the projectiles when they came out the other end. We unloaded those 4 weapons because the barrels were just hot as hell. And when they cool down, you know what happens? They contract. And you don't want to be around when those damn things happen. Then we just took off from there up to Hill 609. At 609, it was open terrain. And we were looking right up at that beast. We were there about 2 or 3 days, and we were shelled 2 or 3 times. Then they shelled the infantry right in front of us. Then they ran me out of there one night to an evacuation hospital and took out my appendix. After Anzio, they took me down to what was called the racetrack on the fairgrounds at Naples and put us in a tent in the replacement depot. And the first night there, the Italians stole everything I had, me and everybody else in the tent. The replacement depot was just a big gambling casino, actually. They said the colonel who ran the base was getting a cut out of the table. He had all kinds of gambling going on, games and poker, and he had sergeants out there hustling, trying to get you to come in and play. I just walked around and looked at it. I was just disgusted, that's all. That went on in the rear echelon. I witnessed it, and I thought, oh, shit. I'd like to have rounded up the whole bunch and sent them up to the front. John was rotated home from Anzio and arrived in the U.S. on the 20th of June, 1944. Not yet 21 years old, but with 6 years of service. He was first sent to another artillery unit, then to an MP unit at Fort Snelling. In 1946, he received the National Guard Direct Commission. There were 6 boys in his family. 5 served overseas. He lost 2 brothers in the war, one at Bataan and one in Italy. He was reactivated for the Korean War and served a total of about 30 years. Delbert Bitzer, Hutchinson, Minnesota, enlisted in the Minnesota National Guard in 1936. He was the mess sergeant for B Company, 135th Infantry. At Hill 609, we had an absolutely perfect gentleman for a company commander. I can still see his face, but I can't recall his name. He was just a splendid leader. He and the sergeant told me they were going to go back where the company was and that we should go and bring the guys some water. Well, we got there and found a wrecked Jeep. It was our company commander's Jeep, so I immediately looked up the medics, and sure enough, it was the company commander and his driver, and they were both killed. By now, we'd built up a trust among us, and it was hard to imagine that something had happened to him so fast. It just proved that the business we were in, you could never be sure for the next 5 minutes that you'd be around. Sometimes you just have to forget what happened and keep going. We did get the water up there, but by the time I got back from the medics, the water had disappeared. Virgil Preview was there, and he said, I didn't get any water. Do you have any more water? I said, no, but how about that guy sleeping over there? He probably has some. Virgil said, he ain't sleeping. He's dead. Well, have you checked to see if he has any water? Well, he said, why don't you check him? I said, okay. So I went and looked him over and didn't think he had any German booby traps on him. So I took a chance and pulled his canteen out, and sure enough, he had a whole canteen full of water. So we had a drink together. He left the 34th after Casino. Because he spoke German, he worked at a POW camp in Sicily before returning to the U.S. After the war, he had various jobs, including being a baker at the FBI school in D.C. and working for the post office. Norbert McCready, Owatonna, Minnesota. F Company, 135th Infantry. Norbert had ancestors in the British Army and in the 10th Minnesota in the Civil War and in the 1862 Dakota War. One of his great-grandfathers served in Minnesota's first legislature. Because of the Depression and his father's ill health, the family fell on hard times. When he was 12 years old, he went out on his own, living and working wherever he could. He joined the National Guard at 15. This is his high school yearbook picture. You'll notice he's wearing his Army uniform because those were his only good clothes. He was 17 years old when he was federalized with the National Guard in 1941. I remember one guy, Jim Matthey. He was in our company. He yelled at me, he said, "Hey, you got a cigarette?" And I said, "Yeah." I went over and he was laying on his side. He had a piece of shrapnel shear his gut, and his guts were laying out on a shelter half. He lived. The last time I saw him was in Lachlan, Nevada. There were terrible things. And you know, I said it so many times, but we were not raised to be killers. We were not raised to see anybody's guts laying out of their stomach. We were not raised to be shot or anything like that. We were raised to be really peaceable people. I always thought of heroes in my mind were the kind of people, the kind of guys who were impervious to that fear of combat and death, a fear of shooting somebody. You talk about it and it sounds great, but you aim a rifle at somebody, which I have done. That's not a good feeling. It's not like you say, "Oh boy, there's a guy and I can shoot at him." What happens is God creates, I describe it as a cocoon, wraps you in a cocoon, because if it didn't, you'd go crazy. It would be just like if you and I went out on a patrol tonight and I saw you with a bullet hole through your forehead. I'd go into panic now. But after you've been in combat for a while, you get wrapped in this cocoon that protects you. And I'll take a look at you and I'll say, "You got it," and light a cigarette, and 5 minutes later somebody is telling a joke, and I'd laugh my head off. Yeah, you became protected from it. You don't even think of it as death. You just think of it as part of your daily existence. And you know you can't go into the state of mourning every time you see somebody dead or with their arm off or something like that. I don't know quite how to explain it. All I know is that I came to the conclusion during the war that this is not really what God created us to be. Not killers, not going and risking our lives every day. I did what I was told to do. I didn't run. I didn't try to avoid contact with the enemy, but I didn't like it. I was scared where the cheeks of my ass used to quiver so bad that I used to say that I'd lose 5 pounds every time there was a close call. I just shudder like that. At the end of the Tunisian campaign, he was poisoned by eating spoiled rations. He was sent to the hospital in Tunis. I heard that F Company, his company, was going to march in the victory parade in Tunis. And so I went to the doctor and I says, "I want to be in that parade." I knew it was a historic event. Eisenhower was there, de Gaulle, Montgomery, and just a tremendous array of brass. They said, "You're not well enough to go." And I said, "I'm going one way or another." So they let me go. And actually, I did all right. Norbert stayed in his unit until 2 weeks after the end of the war. At a replacement depot waiting to go home, they had everybody fall out except the non-commissioned officers for a policing detail where they picked up cigarettes and what butt. Anybody know about police call picking up cigarette butts? Yeah? Okay. Maybe not so much of a problem now because people don't smoke so much. Okay. I never fell out. I just laid there reading a magazine. So about the third day, the guard came along and he said, "You've got to go out in police detail." And I said, "No, you go get the sergeant of the guard." So he came back with the sergeant and I said, "Sergeant, I'm not going to go out picking up cigarette butts." And he said, "Well, you just wait here." And he came back with a first lieutenant, the officer of the day. The officer said, "I understand you're refusing to go out on detail to police the area." And I said, "That's right." And he said, "Well, what's your reason?" I said, "I've been overseas here for 3 years and 4 months. And I have something like 600 combat days. And if I have to pick up one more goddamn cigarette butt in order to get back to the States, you can go ahead and court-martial me." He said, "Come with me." And I thought, well, here it goes. I'm going to the stockade. We went over to this little cubicle of an office. He sat down behind a desk and he said, "Sit down." He pulled out a drawer. He pulled a drawer open on his desk and he brought out a bottle of 7 Crown whiskey. And he said, "Do you like 7 Crown?" And I said, "Oh, yeah." All right. He pulled out another drawer and he put a cigar box full of nickels on top. And he said, "Take a couple nickels and go get us a couple Cokes." So he went and got a couple Cokes and came back in and he handed me a bottle. So I drank it down about a third of the way and filled it up with whiskey. And he did the same with his. And he said, "Will you do me a favor?" I said, "Hell yes." At that point, I'd do anybody a favor for that kind of 7 Crown. He said, "From now on, whenever they say everybody but the non-coms fall out, you just come over here and fix yourself a whiskey and Coke and kind of stick around here until the detail is sent back to the barracks." He said, "You can do that a couple times a day." So for the next week, I'd go over there twice a day and fix myself a couple of 7 Crowns, and it was pretty nice. Norbert flew home on a stripped-down B-17. After his experiences, it took him a little while to settle down into civilian life. He eventually became very involved in Republican politics, had a successful and prosperous life. As of December 2006, when I interviewed him, he had 5 children, 12 grandchildren, and 11 great-grandchildren. But I don't know how many of them know his story. True with all these people. This is Jack Vesey, Minneapolis, First Sergeant, 34th Division Artillery Headquarters Battery. Tempted by the chance to earn 25 cents an hour, Jack Vesey lied about his age and joined the Minnesota National Guard just before his 17th birthday. He rose rapidly in rank and was a battery first sergeant in North Africa. This picture, striking a Napoleonic pose and wearing a French Spahi white colonial cavalry fez, was taken months before his 21st birthday when he had already served nearly 4 years. We were at an old French military post. Living conditions, even by our standards in those days, were appalling. Their equipment was ancient. We were going to war with a lot of equipment left over from World War I, but the French army was in much worse shape. And it wasn't difficult to see why the Germans had gone through them very quickly in 1940. In our army, a whole lot of things didn't work well, but I didn't realize that at the time. At the time, you just think, well, this is the way it is, and it didn't seem that it was particularly disorganized. But looking at it from the perspective of later years of service, it was not well organized, and the logistical train was almost non-existent. We marched into Tunisia, and the Germans gained what to us appeared to be air superiority. By then, when we heard airplanes, we didn't even look up because the basic assumption was that it just belonged to the other side. My first combat experience was just north of Sidi Bouzid, which was the point of Rommel's main attack in February 1943. That was the first really exciting combat experience. I know in anticipation of combat, we always think that problems happen to someone else, but I'll come through it unscathed. The reality of being shelled is a lot different from the expectation, and you learn very quickly that what you thought were adequate fortifications were inadequate fortifications, and individual protective measures and the value of overhead cover and sturdy foxholes became apparent very quickly. Then, when the enemy is pouring through the front lines and the importance of attention to anti-tank defenses, anti-aircraft defenses, field artillery, etc., become very apparent. We talked about it and did perfunctory training in those things before the actual battles. But the need became very apparent very quickly, that our improvements and our tactics, techniques, and procedures became very real. Jack Vesey received, at the time, an unwelcomed battlefield commission at Anzio. He continued to serve in the 34th Division until the end of the war, and he anticipated going to the Pacific. He continued serving in the military for a total of 46 years, attaining every rank from private to 4-star general. This is how he looked at the end of his career. His last military assignment was 10th Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, senior military position in the United States, serving under President Reagan. this is just a tiny fragment of the stories of Minnesota veterans. Questions from the audience?
Leo, you talked about the great record of General Allen. Why was he relieved at the end of this campaign?
He was actually relieved in July of 1943. So it was towards the end of the Sicily campaign. It was after the Battle of Troyena. And what ended up happening was the reason that he was told was, you know, you're exhausted and we want to send back seasoned commanders so that we have guys who can go train, you know, the new guys coming through. He knew it was kind of a story, because he's like, I felt fine. I wasn't exhausted. But Bradley, General Bradley, mainly General Bradley, but also Patton. Bradley felt that he had really kind of fallen in love with the 1st Infantry Division, which meant he was less likely to take risks. And, you know, that was unsatisfactory. You know, at the end of the day, as a general, you have to kind of treat, you know, your divisions as tools to get to an objective. And as callous as that was, there was a reasoning behind it. And Bradley would say one of the hardest things he had to do was every morning when he'd have to wake up and figure out how many men he was going to have to lose that day to accomplish that day's mission. And he felt that with Allen and Allen's love affair, if you want to call it that, with the 1st Infantry Division, was going to eventually have an impact on him and as well as the division's combat effectiveness. So he made the decision to separate the two. And it wasn't just Allen. The assistant division commander, General Roosevelt, Teddy Roosevelt Jr., was also removed. Ultimately, it was not a career ender for either of those gentlemen. General Allen eventually took over the 104th Infantry Division and led it with distinction to the end of the war. And then, of course, General Roosevelt landed at Utah Beach and made the decision to, we're going to start the war right here, which is what he basically said, and went on to earn the Medal of Honor. And unfortunately, he was actually going to be selected for a division command, but then he had his heart attack and died and wasn't able to take on a division. But General Marshall and Bradley said he was going to be taking over a division after that. So ultimately, it was not a real career ender. And you saw that a lot in the Second World War. You know, a guy gets relieved today, and that's it. You're done. But in the Second World War, you saw a lot of, well, maybe this guy didn't get along with this general, or maybe it was just bad luck. And a lot of officers got second chances, whether, you know, another combat command or even some kind of command. In the case of Lloyd Friedenhall, who was the 2nd Corps commander, he was sent home. He did not ever have a combat command again. And he did actually get his 3rd star, and it was interesting. Maybe it was some kind of, some kind of thing that, you know, to ease his pain, I guess, that Eisenhower did. But later on in the war, Eisenhower didn't have that problem anymore. Eisenhower learned to be, and that was one of the things that Eisenhower had to learn to do, is learn to be cutthroat. If the guy wasn't performing, you got to fire him and move on to the next guy. But in 1943, you know, he still had to learn that. And Patton had many chances. But, you know, he fought and he won battles. It reminds me of what Abraham Lincoln said about Grant. You know, I can't spare this man. He fights. And Patton was one of those generals. And towards the end of the war, you know, he's even, as I like to use a phrase from today, he was kind of living rent-free in the Germans' heads, because they were thinking Patton was always kind of behind every corner. And, you know, that's why he was so successful. I don't know how Patton would have done after the Second World War, and it might have been a blessing in disguise that he had that tragic accident, because he needed the war. You know, that's kind of what he lived for. And I don't know if he would have done very well in peacetime. And so he kind of died at the top of his career. So. Tell me. Interestingly enough, originally General Marshall and the U.S. The U.S. military leaders basically asked the same question. Originally, in typical American can-do attitude, we were like, we're going to go to France right now. And that was the thought process as early as, June of 1942. And it was the British that eventually dissuaded them from doing it. In fact, it was more the British dissuading Roosevelt, and Roosevelt was the one that made the decision that, no, we're not ready to go into Northern Europe. And we want to basically be able to control the Mediterranean. And at the time, you got to remember, the British were still getting supplies from their entire empire. And while the Mediterranean was being fought over and Egypt was under threat, the British supplies had to go around, South Africa and come back up. That's a long time to get supplies to the United Kingdom. And so securing the Mediterranean and making it unfettered access so they can basically go up through the Suez and then, of course, through Gibraltar was a huge time saver. And so they wanted to control the Mediterranean. But interestingly enough, the U.S. commanders were asking that same question. Why are we going to North Africa? That doesn't make a lot of... The Germans are up in Germany. Why are we going to North Africa? Roosevelt also had a political thing, because you had the 1942 elections, and there was a lot of questions starting to, what is the American Army doing? Obviously, the Navy is already beating the Japanese. We're in the middle of Guadalcanal, so the Marines are doing stuff. Why are we not fighting the Germans? And so Roosevelt also felt that we needed to get into the war as soon as possible. And he basically sided with the British and decided to go into North Africa. And so ultimately that's why we ended up there.
In the Patton movie, they show George C. Scott reading Rommel's book, Infantry Attacks, and studying at night. And finally, after Alcatar, he says, Rommel, I read your book. How accurate is all that?
Well, there was certainly some of that stuff. The funny thing was Rommel actually wasn't there. Rommel had left North Africa, if I remember correctly, March 6th or 7th. And at that point, he was actually fighting, General von Arnim, who was originally the 5th Panzer Army commander. But yeah, there was some of that going on. I don't know if exactly that particular thing happened. Like I said, there were certain things that the movie did right. He was at Alcatar. He was in Alcatar in the afternoon. He wasn't at Alcatar in the morning. The Germans were attacking. They did have local air superiority, like the movie showed. One of the questions that people have is, how did the Americans and how did the British eventually gain air superiority? And what the soldiers didn't see on the ground was the RAF and the American Air Force were attacking the German airfields. So as the planes are coming back, they're getting shot down, or the airfield's being made unserviceable. But the guys on the ground couldn't see that, nor could Patton. Remember that scene where he's shooting up at the aircraft with the pistol? And there was definitely a perception that, what are our Air Force guys doing?
I got to know if that British General Alexander ever rescinded his statement that the U.S. were like the Italians. After North Africa at some point.
That was more the general perception of the British soldiers. Alexander obviously wasn't impressed with Friedenthal. Ironically, he still had that opinion, and it was a problem pretty much through to the beginning of 1944, that he felt that the Americans were kind of like a second tier when it came to combat effectiveness, and it took a while for him to eventually be dissuaded of that notion. But eventually he was. But initially it was a problem, like in the Sicily campaign and in the other campaigns in Salerno.
Since Rommel was no longer in North Africa, do you think he may have done something different, his style of fighting or whatever, that it might have made a difference if he had not been recalled?
It's a good question. No, von Arnim was actually a pretty good general. And at this point, Rommel was very mercurial. He would have like these ebbs and flows. And he was either really, I guess you could probably say he might have been, bipolar at this point, at the time, because he had really high highs but really low lows. And at this point, he was in one of those really low lows. He was very depressed. And he might have actually done worse at the time. So, and like I said, von Arnim was a pretty solid, pretty effective general. But at the end of the day, when the other guy starts having more beans, more bullets, more tanks, and he can replace his tanks, you can be a great general, but eventually you're just going to get ground down, whether you're, the German army, the Japanese army, the Confederate army. Quantity has a quality all its own, as Stalin would say. And that's pretty much what started to happen in North Africa.
Good. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Support for this program provided by viewers like you. Thank you. Additional support provided through the Catherine B. Anderson Fund of the St. Paul Foundation. Upcoming roundtable topics can be found at www.mn-ww2roundtable.org. Production services provided by Barrows Productions.